You have heard the rumors. Everyone in Eldermore has heard them by now, told 100 ways at 100 hearths, each teller certain he has the truth of it. That the new king had his own stepmother dragged from the throne room in chains. That the Queen Consort spat in his face and cursed the crown before a wall of guards closed around her like a fist. That there was shouting, and a blade, and a woman screaming she would see the whole house of Harrogate burn before she knelt to a boy she had helped raise. I have heard them all, and I am telling you now plainly, because I was the man standing 3 paces from the throne when it happened, and because a lie told long enough begins to wear the face of history. Almost none of it is true. But something did happen at the royal castle that night. Something quieter than the rumors and far harder to forget. I know, because I gave the order that ended it. My name is Corin Ashone, Warden-Sergeant of the Inner Ward of the Greywater Line, and I have kept the door of the throne hall for 11 years, through the last long winter of King Alaric's reign, through the black weeks of his passing, and into the first uncertain days of the king who followed him. I have stood so still for so many hours that visiting lords have knocked on my breastplate to see if there was a man inside it. There is, and that man remembers everything. So let me tell it the way it was, from the first ill omen to the last turn of the key, and you can judge for yourself what really happened at the royal castle, and whether the woman they call a villain in the taverns was arrested for confronting a king, or for something a great deal graver than that. It begins, as these things do, before anyone knew a story had begun. King Alaric had been dying for the better part of a year, though no one at court would say the word. He was a great oak of a man gone hollow, the kind of king the realm had grown so used to that we half believed the mountains would fall before he did. In his prime he had ridden the length of Eldermore twice in a season, settled a border war with a single afternoon of hard talking, and buried his first wife, the late Queen Isolde, with a grief so total that the whole court had wept to see it. Isolde had been the love of his life. Everyone knew it. She had given him his son and heir, Crown Prince Rowan, and then a fever had taken her in the space of 9 days, and Alaric had aged a decade in that single week. I was a young guardsman then, new to the inner ward, and I stood my post outside her sick-room door and heard the king weep like an ordinary man. I have never told anyone that. I am telling you now because it matters to what came after. 3 years past that grief, Alaric married again. Her name was Morwenna. I will try to be fair to her, because a man who keeps the king's door learns that fairness is its own kind of discipline, and because the truth serves no one if I paint her as a monster from the first. She was not born a monster. She was born ambitious in a world that had no room for an ambitious woman except beside a powerful man, and she had spent her whole life learning to make herself indispensable to such men. She came to the marriage a widow already, with a grown son, Lord Cassius, from her first husband, and a daughter, Lady Verena, who had her mother's cool eyes and, I always thought, a little more of a conscience than her mother allowed her to keep. Morwenna was clever. She was beautiful in the hard, kept way of a woman who has decided her face is a tool. And she understood, better than any lord at that court, that power is not a thing you are given but a thing you take one quiet inch at a time, while everyone is looking somewhere else. For 15 years she took her inches, a word in the king's ear here, a rival lord edged out of favor there, the gradual folding of the household's purse strings and appointments and small daily decisions into her own hands, until half the court owed her something and the other half feared her. Alaric, aging and grieving and tired, let her do it, because it is easier to let a strong hand carry the weight than to carry it yourself. That is how it happens, not with a coup. With 1,000 small conveniences that a tired old man is glad to be rid of. But there was one thing Morwenna could never take, and it drove her, I think, half mad across those 15 years. She could not take the succession. Alaric had a son. Rowan was Isolde's boy, born of the marriage everyone still spoke of in hushed reverence, and by every law and custom of Eldermore he was the heir, full stop, no argument. Morwenna's own son Cassius was nobody in the line, a stepson, a courtesy lord, a man with a fine coat and no crown in his future no matter how his mother schemed. And Morwenna wanted her blood on the throne, wanted it the way a drowning woman wants air. Everything she built, every inch she took was in service of that one impossible thing, and the older the king grew, the more impossible it became, and the more dangerous she grew as she felt it slipping. I saw it because I was always there, and no one notices a guard. That is the first thing they teach you in the inner ward, and it is truer than any lesson about drill or blade. You become furniture. Lords conspire in front of you because they have decided you do not exist. I have heard treason discussed over my shoulder as casually as the weather. And so across those last 2 years, I watched the Queen Consort grow harder and quicker and colder, watched her build a little court within a court of men who owed her, watched Cassius swell with a self-importance his mother fed him like a prize hog, and I understood, long before anyone above my station did, that when the old king finally died there would be a reckoning. A woman who has spent 15 years taking inches does not simply stop when the man she took them from is gone. She reaches for the mile. The old king died on a gray morning in the deep of winter. I was on the door. The physicians came out with their faces already arranged into the shape of the news, and the bell in the high tower began to toll, one long stroke and then silence, one long stroke and then silence, the way it does only for a king, and the whole castle went still as if the cold had reached into the stone. I stood my post. That is what you do. The world can end and the door still needs keeping, and there is a strange mercy in that, in having one certain duty when everything certain is dissolving. Rowan became king in that moment. Not at the coronation which would come weeks later with all its gold and choirs, but in that moment by the plain hard law of succession, the son became the sovereign the instant his father's heart stopped. That is the law. It does not wait for ceremony. It does not ask permission. The crown passes in a heartbeat, whether anyone is ready or not, and Rowan, who had loved his father, whatever else was true, became king of Eldermore while the bell was still tolling its first stroke, with his father's body not yet cold. And somewhere in the castle, in her own apartments, the Queen Consort heard that same bell and understood the same law, and understood that her 15 years of inches had just run out of road. I did not see her that first day, but I heard later from a chambermaid who had no reason to lie that when the news reached the Queen Consort's room she did not weep. She sat very still for a long moment, and then she said to no one in a voice quite calm, "So, now we see," and she called for her son. That was the beginning of it. The confrontation the whole realm now whispers about did not happen in a single hot moment of temper. It was built, deliberately, over the 11 days between the old king's death and the thing I am going to tell you. 11 days in which the Queen Consort tried, by every means a clever and desperate woman knows, to keep from becoming what the law had already made her. A widow of no rank, a stepmother with no standing, a private woman in a castle that was no longer hers. Let me tell you about those 11 days, because you cannot understand the night in the throne hall without them. You cannot understand why the guards did what we did, or why it was lawful, or why I would do it again, unless you understand what she reached for first, and how patiently the law let her fail before it finally closed its hand. On the second day, she moved to take the household. It was the most natural thing in the world from her side of it. For 15 years she had run the daily machinery of the castle, the appointments, the monies, the keys, the endless small authorities that add up to real power. On the second day after the king's death, before Rowan had so much as slept a full night in his grief, she simply carried on as if nothing had changed. She summoned the steward. She issued orders in her own name. She signed a warrant for the winter provisioning with the Queen Consort's seal as she had 100 times before, and she expected, as she had 100 times before, that the machine would obey the hand that had always moved it. The steward brought the warrant to the king's men rather than acting on it. That was the first crack in her plan, and she did not see it for what it was. A junior clerk of the treasury, a nervous, careful man named Petrin, whom I had always liked for his honesty, looked at the seal and did a thing that took more courage than any charge on a battlefield. He set the warrant aside and asked, quietly, whose authority it now carried. Because the Queen Consort's seal had been valid when there was a king whose consort she was, and there was no longer such a king. There was a new king, and by the plain law of it, the old consort's seal commanded exactly nothing. She had not thought of that. 15 years of habit had made her forget that her power was never her own. It had always been Alaric's, lent to her hand, and it died with him as surely as he had. When Petrin's careful question came back to her rooms, I am told she went white, and then very quiet, and then she laughed, a short hard sound, and said the boy would learn who truly held this castle together. But she had learned something too. She had learned that the machine would not simply obey her out of habit. That she would have to take it now openly, and that taking it openly meant taking it from the one person the whole apparatus of the realm existed to serve, the king. So on the third day, she went to Rowan. I was on the door for that one. I stood at my post in the antechamber and watched her sweep past me as if I were a co-track, which suited me, and I heard most of what passed between them because the doors to the king's study were open, and grief had made the whole castle careless of who overheard what. She came to him dressed in mourning that had been cut, I noticed, to flatter, a widow's black that somehow still declared its wearer a woman of consequence. Rowan received her standing. He was a tall man, my new king, dark-haired like his mother, the late queen, with a stillness about him that I had always taken for coldness until I served him and understood it was the opposite. It was the stillness of a man holding a great deal in, so that it would not spill out and harm anyone. He had wept for his father in private and shown the court a calm face, and he showed Morwenna that same calm face now, and I think it unsettled her more than any anger would have. She began gently. That was her art. She spoke of continuity, of the fragile days after a king's death, of how the realm needed a steady and familiar hand while the young king found his feet. She offered herself. Not as consort, she was too clever to use the dead word, but as regent in all but name, as the wise elder of the household who would carry the daily burden while Rowan learned the great one. She spoke of the confusion that would follow if the machinery she had run for 15 years were suddenly torn from her hands. She was, in her way, magnificent. Every word was reasonable. Every word was a chain. Rowan listened to all of it. He let her finish, which is a courtesy few kings would have granted, and then he said, in that quiet way of his, "You have served this household a long time, madam. My father valued you. I will not forget it." A pause. "But the household will be run in the king's name now, by the king's men. You are welcome at this court as my father's widow, with every honor due to that station, for as long as you wish to remain. But you hold no office here. There is no office for you to hold." He said it without heat. He said it, I think, as gently as such a thing can be said. And I watched the Queen Consort receive it, and I watched something happen behind her eyes that I have thought about many times since. It was not grief, and it was not even anger, not yet. It was the look of a gambler who has just been told the game she has played her whole life has different rules than she believed, and that she has staked everything on a losing hand, and that the man across the table is too decent to gloat and too firm to yield. It was the most dangerous look I have ever seen on a human face, because it was the look of someone deciding that if the rules would not let her win, she would break the rules. She thanked him. She curtsied to her own stepson, a thing that must have cost her more than the crown itself, and she withdrew. And as she passed me in the antechamber, she stopped, just for a breath, and looked at me directly for the first time in 15 years, actually saw me, the furniture, the man in the armor by the door. And she said, so softly that only I could hear it, "You would do anything he told you, wouldn't you? Anything at all?" I did not answer. It is not my place to answer a member of the royal household, and I did not yet fully understand what she was asking, but I have understood it since. She was taking the measure of the guard. She was asking herself whether the king's men were the king's truly, all the way down, or whether we were merely men who wore his colors, who might, if pushed the right way by the right hand with the right promise, remember that we had families and futures and prices. She was already, on the third day, beginning to plan the thing that would end her, and she began it by testing whether the door could be turned. She could not turn me, but there were others, and over the next days she found them, and this is the part of the story that the rumors get most wrong, so listen closely. The Queen Consort did not confront the king out of grief or madness or wounded pride, whatever the taverns say. She built a plan. It was a good plan, in the cold way that terrible things can be well made. It had 3 parts, and I came to understand all 3 only afterward when we untangled it. But I will lay them out for you now so you can see the shape of what we were standing against that night. The first part was the seal, not the Queen Consort's dead seal, the king's living one. The great seal of Eldermore, the one that makes a mark into law, that turns a king's word into a binding command no one in the realm may refuse. Whoever holds that seal holds the power to make orders real. It lived, by ancient custom, in the keeping room off the throne hall, behind a lock to which only 2 men held keys, the Lord Chancellor and the warden of the inner ward. That second man was my captain, Warden Halloran, an old soldier of the Ravenmore line who had kept that key for 20 years and would sooner have swallowed it than surrendered it. Morwenna needed that seal. Everything she planned turned on it, because her scheme at its heart was not to fight the king openly. She was too clever for that. She would lose, but to produce a document, sealed with the king's own great seal, that granted her the regency in his name. A forgery of authority, made real by the one mark that made things real. If she held such a document, sealed and apparently lawful, then the machinery of the realm would obey it, because the machinery obeys the seal, not the man. She meant to make her power true on paper, and dare the young king to be the one to tear it up in the fragile first days of his reign, before the crowds and the lords who feared nothing so much as more upheaval so soon after a death. The second part of the plan was her son. Lord Cassius had a use at last. Not as an heir, that door was shut, but as a hand. Morwenna needed men inside the castle's works who would move at her word and not the king's, and Cassius, resentful and greedy and desperate to be more than his mother's disappointing shadow, gathered them for her. A pair of the household guard whose gambling debts he quietly bought, a clerk of the treasury with a secret worth keeping, a locksmith's apprentice with a grudge and a soft conscience. Small men, all of them, the kind of small men that great schemes are always built from, each one turned by a different lever: money, fear, spite, love. Cassius fancied himself a spymaster. He was, in truth, a man handing out rope, and he had no notion that his mother would let every one of them hang before she would hang herself. But that came later. The third part of the plan was the hardest and the most desperate, and it is the part that turned her scheme from ambition into a crime. To make the Great Seal do her work, she had to have it. And to have it, she had to move it out of the keeping room, past its 2 keys and its standing guard, which no forged paper could accomplish. So the plan required a moment, a single controlled moment of confusion, in the throne hall itself, on a night she chose, when the seal would be brought out under lawful pretext, and taken. Not stolen in the night like a common thief. Taken openly, in the confusion of a staged confrontation, while every eye was on a shouting match between a queen consort and a king, and no eye at all was on the small, quiet man crossing to the keeping room in the noise. That was the true shape of it. The confrontation the realm now whispers about, the great scene of the widow raging at the young king, was never meant to be a real confrontation at all. It was theater. It was noise, deliberately made to cover a hand reaching for the one object that would make her power law. She would rage, and the court would gasp, and the guards would be drawn to the loud, bright center of the room, and in that drawn-away instant the seal would leave the keeping room forever, and by morning there would be a lawful-seeming warrant of regency in the Queen Consort's hand, and a realm too weary and frightened to fight it. She had thought of everything, almost everything. She had thought of the keys and the clerks and the debts and the noise and the timing. She had thought of how the young king, decent to a fault, would hesitate to have his own stepmother manhandled before the court in the raw days of morning. She had thought of all the ways power moves and all the levers that turn small men. She had not thought about the door. She had not thought that the guard on the keeping room that night would be a man who could not be turned, could not be drawn, could not be made to leave his post by any noise however loud or any rank however high. A man for whom the loud, bright center of the room was exactly the thing his whole training told him to ignore, precisely because it was loud and bright and center, and the danger in a palace is never where the noise is. She had asked me, on the third day, whether I would do anything the king told me. She had asked the wrong question. The right question, the one that would have saved her, was whether I would do anything the law told me, even against the king, even against her, even against my own wish to be merciful to a grieving widow. And the answer to that question was the thing that broke her plan. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you to the 11th night and the throne hall and tell you exactly what really happened. First, though, I have to tell you how we knew. Because that is the part no rumor gives us any credit for, and it galls me a little, I confess. The taverns tell it as though the guards were simply lucky, as though the Queen Consort raged, and by happy chance a guard happened to be standing where he could stop the theft. There was no chance in it. We knew she was coming. We had known for 2 days, and the knowing came of all people from her daughter. Lady Verena was the one part of her mother's plan that Morwenna had trusted too easily, because she had never once in 20 years imagined that her daughter had a conscience of her own. Verena had her mother's cool eyes and her mother's clever tongue, and Morwenna assumed, as such people do, that a child raised in the practice of scheming would have no soul left to trouble her. She was wrong. I think Verena had watched her mother her whole life the way I had watched the court, from the corner, unnoticed, learning what she was not meant to learn, and I think somewhere in her she had decided she would not become the woman who had made her. She came to the inner ward on the 9th night. Not to me, I was too low. She went to Warden Halloran, my captain, and she asked to speak with him alone, and whatever she told him drained the color from a face I had thought too old and leathery to lose any. She did not betray the whole plan. I don't believe she knew the whole plan. Her mother kept her pieces separate. But she knew enough. She knew there was to be a scene in the throne hall, staged on a night soon. She knew her brother had bought men inside the household. And she knew this was the thing that had frightened her enough to come, that her mother had spoken, once in a low certain voice, of the Great Seal, and of a night when everyone would be looking the wrong way. Halloran did not act rashly. That is the mark of a good warden. A lesser man would have arrested Cassius on the spot, seized the bought guards, gone to the king with a great clatter of alarm, and accomplished nothing but to warn Morwenna that her plan was known, so that she could simply wait and try again a year later more carefully, when no daughter's conscience stood between her and the seal. Halloran did the harder thing. He let the plan run. He kept Verena's name out of everything for her own safety, and because a source you burn is a source you cannot use twice. And he came to me. I remember the conversation exactly. It was late, past the second watch, and he found me coming off the antechamber post and drew me into the guardroom where the fire was low and the other men were sleeping, and he told me what Verena had told him, and then he sat back and looked at me a long time. "Corin," he said at last, "I am going to put you on the keeping room, every night this week and next until this thing breaks or dies. Do you understand what I am asking you to keep?" "The seal, sir." "The seal," he agreed, "but more than the seal." He leaned forward. His voice, when he went on, was the quietest I ever heard it. "There is going to come a night, Corin, when there is a great noise in the throne hall. The Queen Consort is going to make it. And every instinct you have, Every good and loyal instinct is going to scream at you to turn toward that noise. Because your king will be at the center of it. Because a woman will be raging at him, and it will look like the danger is there, at the throne, and your whole heart will want to go and stand between your king and the trouble. He put his weathered hand flat on the table between us. "You will not go," he said. "Whatever you hear, whatever you see out of the corner of your eye, however much your king seems to need a good man at his side. You will stand your post at the keeping room and you will keep that door, because the noise is the trick and the door is the truth. And if you leave that door for one breath, everything we are trying to protect walks out of this castle in another man's coat. Can you do that? Can you stand still while your king is shouted at 10 paces away and not move to help him?" I understood then exactly what he was asking, and it was a harder thing than any charge or any wound. He was asking me to look like a coward, to stand at a far door, rigid and useless, while the whole court watched a widow scream at their new king, and no doubt cursed the guards for stone men who would not move to defend their sovereign. He was asking me to let the rumor be born, the rumor of the frozen, unfeeling guard, and to bear it, so that the truth could be kept. "I can do that, sir," I said. And I did. That is the answer to the question the whole realm has been asking about the guards that night. Why did they not move? Why did they stand like statues while the Queen Consort raged? We did not move because moving was exactly what she had built the whole thing to make us do. We stood still because our stillness was the last lock on the last door, and we had been told, and we had chosen, and we kept it. The discipline the tavern tellers mock as coldness was the only thing in that room that could not be turned, bought, drawn, or frightened. It was the discipline that saved the realm, but it did not look like saving. That is the cruel thing about doing the quiet right thing at the loud wrong moment. It never looks like what it is. So the 11th night. It was the eve of a small council, not the coronation that was still to come, but a first gathering of the great lords of Eldermore to swear their preliminary fealty to the new king, and to see, with their own eyes, that the realm was steady and the succession clean. Morwenna had chosen it well. It was the one night in those 11 when the throne hall would be full of lords who feared upheaval, full of witnesses, full of exactly the audience she needed to make her scene land, and to make the young king hesitate to answer it harshly. A private confrontation she could always be sent quietly away from. A public one before the assembled peers of the realm in the raw days of mourning, that she could turn into a crisis. Rowan would have to choose, before every lord who mattered, between manhandling his grieving stepmother and appearing to be pushed around by her in his own hall. Either choice cost him. She had built a trap with no clean exit. The hall filled at dusk. I took my post at the keeping room door as I had every night that week, a narrow iron-bound door set in the paneling at the north end of the hall, well back from the throne, easy to overlook, which was rather the point of it. From where I stood, I could see the whole hall down its length, the long double rows of lords in their mourning finery, the great cold hearths, the throne on its dais of pale stone at the far south end, and the young king already seated upon it, still as I have said he could be, wearing his father's plain iron circlet because the golden crown was not yet his to wear. Beside the throne, one step down, stood the Lord Chancellor with his chain of office, and near him old Halloran, my captain, in the full array of the warden, his key to the keeping room on a chain beneath his tunic where I could not see it but knew it hung. Guards lined the walls at their intervals. Everything looked exactly as it should. Everything was arranged. I found the bought men without trying. That is a thing about standing a post for 11 years. You learn a room the way a farmer learns weather, and wrongness announces itself. 2 of the wall guards stood a hand's breadth off their proper marks, closer to the keeping room than the pattern called for, and one of them could not keep his eyes from drifting to my door and away, to my door and away. He was sweating in a cold hall. He was one of Cassius's debtors, and he was, I judged, about to be sick with fear, and he was the man who was meant to reach the seal when the noise pulled me off my mark. I looked at him once levelly and then looked away, and let him wonder what I had seen. Small men unravel faster when they think they are watched. Lord Cassius himself stood midway down the hall among the lesser lords, dressed too finely, a small private smile on his face like a man at a play he has already read the ending of. He thought he knew the ending. He did not. And then, at the appointed hour, the doors at the north end of the hall opened, and the Queen Consort came in. She had dressed for it. I will grant her that she understood spectacle the way a general understands ground. She wore not morning black that night, but a deep midnight blue shot through with silver, the color a queen wears, not a widow, and on her brow she wore a circlet. It was not the crown of a Queen Consort of Eldermore. That had been the late Queen Isolde's, and after her Morwenna's by the king's grace, and it had been surrendered with all the other regalia into the keeping of the realm on the day Alaric died, as the law required. This was a lesser circlet of her own, silver set with sapphires, chosen to read as a crown from a distance to lords who would not look closely. She meant to walk into that hall already wearing the authority she had come to seize, so that half the room would have accepted it in their eyes before a word was spoken. It was clever. Everything she did was clever. That was always the trouble with her. You could not comfort yourself that she was a fool. She came up the center of the hall, and the lords parted before her, and a murmur ran through them like wind through wheat. She did not go to the throne directly. She stopped in the open space before the dais, at the exact center of the hall, where the light from the high windows fell, where every lord could see her and she could see them, and she turned slowly to take in the whole assembly, and only then did she look up at the young king on the throne of his father. "My lords of Eldermore," she said, and her voice carried, she had trained it over 15 years to fill a hall. "I am glad you are gathered. There are things that must be said before this realm goes any further down a dangerous road, and they are better said before witnesses than whispered in corners. I have kept silent through 11 days of grief. I will keep silent no longer." I stood at my door. I did not move. Down the hall I saw the sweating guard shift his weight and Cassius's little smile deepen, and the whole room lean in toward the bright loud center of it, exactly as she had built them to. This was the noise. I kept the door. 11 days ago," she went on, "my husband, your king, died in my arms." A lie. He had died with his physicians. I had been on the door. She had not been in the room, but I said nothing, and neither did anyone who knew better, because that is how such lies work. They are told in front of the people who could deny them precisely because those people will not make a scene. For 15 years I stood beside him. I ran this household. I held this court together through his long illness, when the man you all revered could no longer hold it himself. Every one of you who has been fed at this castle, housed at this castle, paid from this treasury in these last years, you have been fed and housed and paid by my hand. I do not say this for thanks. I say it because it is true, and because the boy who now sits on that throne would have you forget it. The boy, she called the king the boy before the assembled lords of the realm and let it hang there. It was a small blade, and she slipped it in expertly. Half the room flinched. A few of the older lords, men who had known Rowan since his childhood and perhaps still half saw a child when they looked at him, did not flinch at all, and those were the men she was speaking to. Rowan said nothing. He sat still on his father's throne and let her speak, and his stillness was so complete that it began, slowly, to change the temperature of the room, because a young man flustered would have proven her point. A young man shouting back would have made the crisis she wanted. But a young man who simply sat and listened and did not flinch at the boy that began to look, the longer it went on, less like weakness and more like the thing it was, which was a king letting a subject speak her fill before he answered. She felt it. I saw her feel it, and she pressed harder to break it. "He would strip me of every office," she said, turning back to the lords, her voice climbing now toward the pitch of grievance. 11 days a widow, and already I am nobody in the house I ran for 15 years. My seal is refused. My orders are set aside by clerks. I who held this realm's daily life in my 2 hands am told there is no office for me to hold." She threw the king's own gentle words back up at him, twisted into an insult. "Is this the gratitude of the house of Harrowgate? Is this the justice of your new king, my lords? That the woman who kept your realm running through its darkest years is cast out into an empty widowhood the moment the old king's back is turned to the grave?" It was working. I could hear it working. The murmur in the hall had a different note now, an uneasy, sympathetic note, and I saw more than one lord glance up at the young king with something like doubt. This was the moment she had built toward. Get the room uneasy, get them doubting, get the young king forced to choose between cruelty and surrender, and in the thick of it the seal. I watched the sweating guard's hand drift, just an inch, toward the ring of keys at his belt that he had no lawful business carrying. I watched Cassius, down the hall, half turn as if to ease toward the north end. The theft was coming. The noise was at its peak, and under the noise the hand was reaching. And every part of me that Halloran had warned about screamed to move to go to my king, who was being savaged before his lords, who surely needed a loyal man at his side. I kept the door. And then Rowan spoke, and everything changed. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He let a silence fall first, let her last words hang and cool in the air until the room grew uncomfortable with them. And then he spoke into that silence quietly, so that the lords had to still themselves and lean in to hear their own king, which put them, without his lifting a finger, back under his hand. "Madam," he said, "you have said your piece, and I have heard it, and there is truth in some of it. You did carry much when my father could not. I have not forgotten it, and I said as much to you 8 days ago in private with respect. You have chosen to repeat that conversation here before these lords, and to leave out the parts that do not serve you. So let me finish it since you have begun it in public." He let that land. "You say I would strip you of your offices. Madam, I cannot strip you of what you do not hold. When my father lived, his authority was yours to wield because he chose to lend it. That is what a consort's power is. It is the king's, held in trust for as long as the king lives. My father is dead. God rest him, I loved him better than you will ever know. And when he died, everything that was his by the crown returned to the crown in the same heartbeat, by the same law that made me king. Not because I willed it. Because it is the law, the same law that would have made me nobody had I been the one to lose. Your seal is not refused out of spite. It is refused because it is no longer a seal of any office. There is no cruelty in it, and no ingratitude. There is only the law, which does not bend for me and will not bend for you." The room was utterly silent now. He had answered her completely, and he had done it without heat, and every lord in that hall who had wavered a moment before was now watching a young king explain the law of the realm as steadily as his father might have, and the doubt was draining out of them, and I saw Morwenna understand that her scene was failing. So she reached for the last lever she had, the one that turned it from a losing argument into a crime. She produced a document. It came out of her sleeve or her bodice, I could not see, but suddenly it was in her hand, a folded parchment, and she held it up above her head so that every lord could see it, and there was a seal upon it, a great red disk of wax, and my heart went cold in my chest, because from where I stood at a distance it looked for all the world like the great seal of Eldermore. "The king speaks of the law," she cried, and her voice had found a new register entirely now, high and ringing and triumphant. "Let us speak of the law, then. I hold here a warrant. It is sealed with the great seal of the realm. It grants to me the regency of Eldermore, and the care of the king's household and treasury, until such time as the coronation is complete and the king is of an age and experience to rule unaided. It was sealed in my husband's own hand in his last days, when he saw clearly what a boy of a king would face, and it is law, my lords, sealed law, and there is not a man in this realm who may set it aside, not even the king himself, for the great seal does not lie." The hall erupted. Lords surged to their feet. Half of them believed her in that instant, believed that the old king, dying and afraid for his son, had made his widow regent and set it in wax, and that they were now bound by it whatever they thought of the woman. The uproar was exactly what she needed. The noise doubled and doubled again, men shouting questions, other men shouting them down, the whole disciplined order of the hall dissolving into confusion. And under the confusion, the hand reached for the door. The sweating guard broke from his mark. He moved fast, low, toward the keeping room, toward me, his key already in his fist, his eyes fixed not on my face but on the lock behind me, because in the plan I was supposed to be gone. In the plan the noise had drawn me 20 paces south toward my endangered king, and the keeping room stood open behind an empty post, and all he had to do was reach the true Great Seal and carry it out in the chaos while a forged one held every eye in the hall. But I had not moved. I was exactly where I had been all night, filling the door, and he was almost upon me before his eyes came up off the lock and found me still standing in it, and I watched the whole plan die in his face in the space of one heartbeat. "Stand where you are," I said, quietly. I did not shout. A shout would have drawn eyes, and I did not want eyes yet. "You have a key you have no right to. Set it on the floor and step back to your mark, and you may yet live out this night a free man. Take one more step toward this door and you will not." He stopped. He was no soldier, whatever coat he wore. He was a frightened man in debt, and he looked at me and he looked at the little iron door, and he understood all at once that the one thing the whole plan had needed, the one door left open, was shut and had never been open and was kept by a man who had known he was coming. The key fell out of his hand and rang on the stone floor. He stepped back. He was weeping, I think. I did not much care. I had a door to keep, and the crime in the room had only half revealed itself. Because the true danger was never the sweating man with the key. The forged seal was the danger, and now I understood the whole shape of it, standing there with a dropped key ringing at my feet. I understood that she had not needed to steal the true seal at all if the room believed in the false one. The theft of the true seal was a fallback, a second blade. Her real weapon was the forged warrant in her raised hand, the sealed law she was daring the king to defy before his frightened lords. And that forged warrant was a graver crime by far than a stolen disc of wax. To forge the great seal of the realm, to counterfeit the king's own binding mark and pass it off as law before the assembled peers, that is not ambition. That is not even theft. In Eldermore and in every realm I have ever heard of, the counterfeiting of the sovereign seal is treason, plain and named, the highest crime a subject can commit, and it does not matter one whit whether the subject is a beggar or a queen consort. The law is the law, or it is nothing. I looked down the hall. Halloran, my captain, had come off the dais. He had seen the guard break from my door, and he had seen me hold it, and now he was moving not toward me, toward the center, toward the queen consort with her forged warrant held high, and his face was the face of a man who has finally been handed the moment he has waited 2 days for. And I understood that my captain had planned for this exact instant. He had let the plan run precisely so that she would produce the forgery in front of the whole assembled peerage of the realm, so that the crime would be committed openly, witnessed by 100 lords, undeniable, because a queen consort scheming in shadows is a thing you can only whisper about, but a queen consort holding a forged royal seal above her head before the peers of the realm is a thing the law can close its hand around and never let go. She had built a trap for the king. Halloran had built a better one for her out of the very noise she made. "Give that document to the Lord Chancellor," said Rowan from the throne. He had risen now at last, and standing he was very much his father's son, and the hall quieted at his rising the way it had not quieted for all her ringing. "If it bears the great seal, madam, then you are right, and not I nor any man here may set it aside, and I will yield the regency to you before these lords tonight. I mean that. If my father made you regent under the great seal, I am bound by it, and I will honor it whatever it costs me. Give it to the chancellor. Let him read the seal." It was, I think, the cleverest thing my young king ever did, and he did it in a single breath, because she could not refuse. To refuse to let the Chancellor examine the seal she had just sworn was real would be to confess it false before the whole hall. She had trapped herself the instant she raised the forgery. She had staked everything on the seal being examined and believed, and now the king, calmly, was calling her bluff by simply agreeing to be bound by it. The only way out was for the seal to be genuine, and it was not, and everyone in that hall was about to watch it be proven not. I saw her understand it. I saw the whole edifice of 15 years of inches come down behind her cool eyes in a single instant, and I saw her make the last choice of her life as a free woman, the choice that the rumors, for all they get wrong, get right in its bones. She chose not to yield. "You will not touch this," she said, low and shaking, backing away from the Chancellor's outstretched hand, clutching the forged warrant to her chest. "You conniving boy, you are nothing. You are Isolde's whelp and nothing more. I made this court, I made this castle. I held it in my 2 hands while your father rotted, and I will not hand it to you like a servant handing up a dropped glove." And then she did the thing that ended it. Not the shouting was only shouting, and a widow may shout at a king and be forgiven it in her grief. She reached in her desperation for the one thing that could still save her plan. She turned toward the dais, toward the throne, toward the young king himself, and she drew from her sleeve a small bright thing, and it was a blade. I want to be careful here, because this is the part the rumors have swollen into a monstrous thing, and the truth is both smaller and worse than the tavern versions. It was not a war blade. It was a small ornamental dagger, the kind a highborn woman wears at court as jewelry, a thing of silver and enamel meant to be looked at and never used. I do not believe, even now, that she truly meant to kill the king with it. I have thought about it for a long time, and my honest judgment, and I am the man who was closest to the whole business, is that she drew it in the way a drowning person grabs at anything, not as a plan but as a last mad reach, a threat, a bid to seize the one hostage that might still let her walk out of that hall with her scheme alive. Hold a blade near the king's person, force the guards to freeze for fear of him, and turn the whole failing crime into a standoff she might yet bargain her way out of. But here is the thing that no rumor understands, the thing that is the whole heart of what I am telling you. It did not matter what she meant. It did not matter that it was a jeweled toy and not a war blade. It did not matter that she was a grieving widow or a queen consort or a woman who had once, long ago, been kind to a young guardsman on a cold morning. Yes, she had once. I have not told you that. It is true, and it changed nothing. The instant she drew steel and turned it toward the person of the king, she became, in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of every guard in that hall, a single thing, an armed body moving on the sovereign. And there is no rank in the realm, no grief, no history, no crown that changes what the guard must do about an armed body moving on the king. There is only the duty, and the duty is old, and it does not ask her name. The wall guards moved, all of them in the same instant, the whole disciplined line of them coming off their marks at once, not because anyone shouted an order, but because it is the one thing every one of us is trained into our bones from the first day. Steal toward the king, and you move, and you do not stop to think about who holds it. That is what the discipline is for, not for parades, for this. For the one instant in a lifetime of standing still when everything depends on 100 men moving as one body without a moment's hesitation, without weighing rank or pity, because the moment you weigh it is the moment the king is dead. And I moved too. I will tell you what I did, and I will not dress it up. I left my door. After 11 nights of keeping it, after all of Halloran's warning, after standing rigid while the whole court thought me a coward, I left the keeping room and I crossed the hall, because the calculus had changed in a single heartbeat. The seal was safe, the sweating guard was down and weeping, and the key was on the floor, and the false warrant was about to be proven false. The door no longer needed keeping the way the king now needed a body between him and the steel. That is the discipline too, the harder half of it that the rumors never grasp. The guard's stillness is not stubbornness, it is judgment. You hold the post that matters until a post that matters more appears, and then you move all at once without hesitation, and God help you if you read the room wrong. I read it. I moved. I reached her first. Not because I was the bravest, the whole line was moving, but because I had positioned myself all night, without quite admitting to myself why, at the one point in the hall from which a straight fast line ran to the space before the dais. Some part of me had been standing ready for exactly this the entire time. I reached her as her arm came up, and I did the thing you are trained to do, which is not to strike and not to wound but to control. I took the wrist of the hand that held the blade, took it in the grip they teach you for exactly this, high on the arm where the leverage is, and I turned it up and away from the king, and the small jeweled dagger dropped from fingers that had no real strength behind them, and it fell and skittered across the pale stone of the dais and came to rest against the foot of the throne. Harmless, a piece of a court lady's jewelry lying spent on the floor. She did not fight me. That surprised me, and it has stayed with me. The instant the blade left her hand she went still, and then she sagged, and I was half holding her up. This woman I had watched take her inches for 15 years, and she was suddenly and simply an aging widow whose every scheme had failed in a single hall on a single night, held upright by the arm of a guard she had once tried to weigh the price of. The hall had gone silent again, the kind of silence that comes after a great noise, thick and ringing. 100 lords stood frozen. The young king stood on his dais, unharmed, looking down not at the blade at his feet but at the woman in the guard's grip, and there was no triumph in his face at all. There was something closer to grief. And now, this is the part that matters most, the part I most want you to understand, because it is the part that makes this a story worth telling, and not just a story of a woman brought low. Now came the moment when everything could have gone wrong. Now came the moment when the law itself was in danger. Because in that ringing silence, a lord's voice cried out from the body of the hall, one of the older men, red-faced with fury at what he had just seen. "Kill her!" She drew on the king. "Guards, cut her down where she stands." And other voices took it up, a swelling, ugly chorus of them, lords who a quarter hour before had half believed her and now, having seen steel drawn on their sovereign, wanted blood, wanted it that instant, wanted the guards to do the swift, terrible thing that frightened men always want done in the heat of a fright. "Cut her down. She is a traitor. The king's guards will avenge the king." I held her wrist. She was shaking, and I felt running through that hall the terrible, easy pull of it, the pull to be the instrument of the room's fury, to do the thing 100 powerful voices were screaming for, to strike down the traitor and be a hero in the telling of it forever after. Every man in that guard line felt it. I saw it in their faces. The mob wanted a killing, and we were the hands that could give it one. And there is no drug in the world quite like 100 great lords screaming that you would be right too. And I will tell you what I did, and it is the thing I am proudest of in 11 years of keeping the king's door, prouder than holding the seal, prouder than reaching the blade. I did nothing. I held her wrist, and I held my place, and I did not move to harm her by a hair, and I said, loudly enough now to carry over the shouting, in the flat, plain voice we are taught for exactly the moments when the powerful want us to become something we are not. "No." The word fell into the shouting like a stone into water, and the shouting faltered around it. "No," I said again, into the space it made. "We do not cut down a prisoner on the floor of the king's hall because a room is angry. That is not what the king's guards are for. She is disarmed. She is held. She has done nothing now that a rope in a shouting hall may lawfully answer. She will be detained and charged and tried under the law of Eldermore before a proper court on evidence, as any subject of this realm would be, the highest or the lowest. That is the law. And the law is the only thing standing between this hall and the very thing she tried to make of it tonight. A place where the powerful and the frightened do as they please to whoever is weakest in the moment, and call it justice. I do not know where the words came from. I am not a speaking man. But I had kept the king's door for 11 years, and I had thought in all those silent hours about what the door was actually for, and it turns out I knew. The door is for this. The whole vast apparatus of the guard, the discipline, the stillness, the refusal to be moved by rank or noise or fear. It is all in the end for this single moment. The moment when the mob is right there and the mob is wrong, and someone who cannot be moved has to be the one who does not move. A lord near the front, the red-faced one, rounded on me. You forget yourself, guardsman. You are a servant, when your betters give you an order. I take my orders from the king and the law, I said, not from a hall. With respect, my lord, you are not the king. And then Rowan spoke, and I have never in my life been so glad to hear another man's voice. He is right, said the king. He said it quietly as he said everything, but the hall heard it because they had learned that night to go quiet when he spoke. Warden-Sergeant Ashone is right, and every lord who is calling for a killing in my father's hall is wrong, and I will remember which of you did the one and which the other. He let that land, and I watched several red faces go pale. The guard has done exactly what the guard is meant to do, not more, which would be murder, and not less, which would be my death. He has held the law when it would have been far easier to break it. That is the whole of what I ask of the men who keep my door, and tonight I have seen it done, and I will not have it repaid with a lord's demand that he become an executioner on a shout. He came down from the dais then, down the steps, slowly, to stand before the woman I was holding, and he looked at her a long moment close, and whatever passed between them in that look was not mine to read. "Madam," he said at last, and his voice was gentle again, and somehow that was the hardest thing of all to watch. "You held a blade toward my person before the assembled peers of the realm. You raised before them a warrant bearing a counterfeit of the Great Seal of Eldermore. I do not need the Chancellor to read it now. Your refusal to let him read it has read it plainly enough. Either of those things, by the law of this realm, is treason, not because I name it so, because the law names it so, and the law does not know your face." He drew a breath. "I take no joy in this. Whatever you were to my father, whatever you did in the years when you carried what he could not, I would have let you live out your days in honor as his widow. You chose otherwise. And now it is out of my hands and out of yours, and in the hands of the law, which is exactly where it should be, and exactly where you never wanted it to go." He straightened, and he spoke the words that the whole realm has since garbled into 100 lies, and I will give them to you exactly, because they were plain and they were lawful, and there was no cruelty in them at all. Warden Halloran. The Queen Consort is to be detained, on the charge of treason against the crown and realm, to be held in honorable confinement befitting her station, and to be tried before the High Court of Eldermore when it can be lawfully convened, upon the evidence of this hall and this warrant. She is to be handled with the dignity due to a lady of the court and the widow of a king. No hand is to be laid on her in anger. Any man who mistreats her will answer to me. Take her. That is what happened. That is the truth of it. Not dragged in chains, walked, upright, held gently by the arm, out of the throne hall through a corridor of silent lords, to a warm apartment with a guard on the door and every comfort but her freedom. Not struck, not spat upon, not humiliated. Detained lawfully on a real charge, committed openly before her peers, to be answered by a real court. The whole terrible machinery of tavern rumor, the chains, the screaming, the king's cruelty, the blood, none of it happened. What happened was quieter and I think greater. What happened was that the law held. I did not take her out myself. Halloran did that with 2 steady older men, and I let go of her wrist and stepped back and returned to my post at the keeping room, because that was still my post, and there was still, until the king released me from it, a door to keep. But as Halloran took her arm and turned her toward the doors, she looked back not at the king, and not at the lords, and not even at her son Cassius, who had gone the color of ash and was trying very hard to become invisible in the crowd. She looked at me. "You," she said, "just that. And then after a moment, in a voice with all the ring gone out of it, quiet enough that I think only I heard, "I asked you once if you would do anything he told you." A pause. "I asked the wrong thing." "Yes, madam," I said, "you did. And they took her out. The rest I can tell more quickly, though it matters, because a story that ends at the arrest is only half a story, and the taverns never trouble with the half that shows whether the thing was truly just. The forged warrant was examined that same night, before the whole hall, by the Lord Chancellor, and by 3 of the oldest and most respected lords present, chosen deliberately from among the very men who had half believed her. The great seal upon it was a good forgery, a very good one, but it was a forgery, and the proof was not hard to find once men who knew the true seal held it under a strong lamp. The true great seal of Eldermore carries, worked into the wax by an old and secret art, a mark within the mark that only a handful of men in each generation are taught to make and to read. The forger, whoever he was, had not known of it, because it is not a thing that can be known from the outside. Where the hidden mark should have been, there was smooth wax. That was all it took. The lords who had wavered saw it with their own eyes, and were ashamed, and their shame made them her firmest accusers after, as shame often does. And the true seal itself, the thing I had kept my door for through 11 nights, had never left the keeping room at all. It sat behind me the whole time, untouched, exactly where it was meant to be, because the one door that mattered had been kept. I confess I did not open the keeping room that night to look at it. I did not need to. I knew it was there. A man who has kept a thing well does not need to check it. The keeping is the knowing. Cassius was taken before dawn. He did not resist. Men of his kind never do, when the scheme is up and the mother is gone, and there is no one left to be brave in front of. He gave up the bought guards, the treasury clerk, the locksmith's boy, the whole poor scaffolding of small men his mother had let him build in exchange for his life, which the king granted him, because a stepson who handed out rope is not a stepson who forged the seal, and the law knows the difference between the two. He was stripped of his courtesy titles and sent to a distant holding of the crown, to live out a small life on a small allowance, watched. It was, I think, exactly the fate that would gall him worst, not death, not a dungeon, but obscurity, the very thing he and his mother had spent their lives clawing away from. He is there still, so far as I know. No one speaks of him. The sweating guard who dropped his key, I made a point of telling the king the truth of him, that he had stopped when told, that he had not reached the seal, that he was a frightened man drowning in debt and not a hardened traitor. It is easy, in the flush of a great scheme uncovered, to sweep all the small men into the same fire. I did not want that on my conscience. The king heard me. The man was punished. He had to be. He had carried a key he had no right to carry into the king's presence, but he was punished as a weak man led astray, not as a traitor, and he kept his life and one day, perhaps, his self-respect. I have wondered since whether I did right by him. I think I did. The law is not only for closing the hand. It is for opening it too, at the right measure, and knowing which is the whole of the thing. The trial came 6 weeks after, before the High Court of Eldermore, convened lawfully, with the peers as her jury as her rank required, and every scrap of it done in the open. I gave my evidence. I stood in a courtroom instead of a doorway, and I told it plainly as I have told it to you, and I did not embellish it, and I did not spare her, and I did not spare the lords who had shouted for her blood either, because the truth is owed to everyone or it is owed to no one. She was found guilty. She could not be. 100 lords had watched her raise the forged seal and draw the blade. But the king, who could have had her head by the old law and would have been within his right, did not ask for it. He asked instead for confinement, comfortable, dignified, permanent, in a quiet holding far from the court, where she would live out her years as a lady, with books and a garden and a window, and no power over any living soul ever again. Some called it mercy. Some called it weakness. I call it the last discipline of a good king, to give the law its due without giving the mob its blood. She lives yet, I am told, in that quiet place. She tends the garden. She does not speak of the court. And Lady Verena, I have not forgotten her, and neither did the king, though her part was never spoken aloud, not once in any courtroom or any corridor, because Halloran kept her name buried as deep as the true seal, and I have kept it buried too until now, and I trust you to keep it after me. She was never charged, never suspected, never touched. She came to her mother's confinement once, I am told, and they spoke, and no one knows what passed between them. Afterward she left the court of her own choosing and went to live modestly on a small estate of the late Queen Isolde's, the very estate her mother had once schemed to seize, where, by the king's quiet arrangement, she wants for nothing. She had done a hard and lonely thing on the 9th night. She had chosen the realm over her own blood, chosen the law over her mother, and she had done it knowing she could never be thanked for it in the open, that the best outcome she could hope for was that no one would ever know. That is a purer kind of duty than mine, I have always thought. I keep a door and the whole world sees me do it. She broke her mother's plan in the dark and asked for nothing and got nothing but a quiet life and a clean conscience, and I hope the second was worth the price of the first. I believe it was. I have to believe it was. As for the rumors you asked at the start, what really happened at the royal castle, and now you know, and you can see how far the telling has drifted from the thing. The taverns needed a monster and a cruelty and a scene of chains, because a true story of a law quietly held is not a thing that sells a second flagon. So the widow became a screaming witch, and the young king became a tyrant, and the guards became either brutes who dragged a woman in irons or cowards who stood frozen while their king was assailed. We were neither. We stood still when stillness was the duty, and we moved when moving was, and in the one moment when 100 powerful men screamed at us to become killers, we said no, and held the law between the mob and the woman it wanted to tear apart. That is not a story that makes a good rumor. It is only the truth. I am an old man now, or nearly. Rowan has been king for many years, a good one, better than his father in some ways and never quite so beloved, which is often the price of being just where your father was merely warm. His queen, Princess Alara as she was, is beloved enough for both of them, and their children have grown up in a castle where the law is a real thing, and not a mask over the will of whoever is strongest, and that is worth more than any of them will ever know, because they will never have to learn what its absence costs. I still keep a door, though a lesser one now. Younger men keep the great posts, and I train them, and the thing I try hardest to teach them is the thing that is hardest to teach, which is not how to stand still, but how to know the one moment in 10,000 when standing still is wrong. Because that is the whole of it in the end. Anyone can be still. Any statue is still. The discipline of the guard is not the stillness. It is the judgment of when the stillness ends and what it ends into, and the refusal, at the crucial instant, to let it end into the wrong thing, whether the wrong thing is a hand reaching for a seal or 100 lords screaming for a killing. The Queen Consort thought our discipline was a lever she could pull, a thing that would make us move when she wanted or freeze when she wanted, if only she found the right pressure. She never understood that it was the opposite of a lever. It was the one thing in that castle that could not be pulled, not by rank, not by fear, not by fury, not by grief, not even by the king himself had he ordered a wrong thing, though God be thanked he never did. The law held that night because a few people, in a few quiet moments no rumor remembers, chose to let it. A daughter who told what she knew and asked for nothing. A warden who let a plan run so the crime could be seen. A young king who called a bluff instead of losing his temper, and who refused a mob a killing it would have thanked him for. And a guard at a small door who did not move when the whole world told him to, and then moved when it mattered. And then, in the loudest moment of his life, spoke a single word against a room full of his betters and made it stick. That word was no. It is the most important word a guard knows. Not yes, your majesty. Not at once, my lord. No, spoken calmly, spoken to power, spoken in defense of the one thing worth defending, which is the law that stands the same over the highest head and the lowest, or it stands over none. So now you know what really happened at the royal castle. The Queen Consort was arrested after confronting the king. That much of the rumor is true. But she was not arrested for confronting him. A subject may confront a king and be within her rights. Grief and anger are not crimes, and Rowan would have forgiven her a haul full of hard words. She was arrested for forging the seal of the realm and drawing steel on her sovereign, for treason plainly before 100 witnesses, and she was arrested lawfully, gently, and answered by a real court and not by a rope in an angry room. The rank of the accused changed nothing. That was the whole point. That was always the whole point. The law does not know your face. I keep my door. The realm is quiet. And when the young ones I train ask me, as they always do, whether it is really true, all of it, the story of the Queen Consort and the throne hall and the guard who said no, I tell them yes, it is true, though not the way the taverns tell it. And then I tell them to stand up straight, and mind their post, and remember that the whole weight of the realm can come down to one man at one small door deciding not to move. It usually does.